Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. You need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is the first December show of the Cameron Parker Show. It is December 5th. And as always, we are joined on this Tuesday by Fantasy Gurus Insider, CJ Krainock. How you doing on this Tuesday?
Dude, I am fantastic. How about you, Cameron?
I'm doing great. I'm kind of like inching for it to be like Christmas already. I mean, I'm kind of shocked that we're already in December, frankly, but I'm trying to breathe and accept the fact that Christmas is literally 2 weeks away.
Yeah, it always seems to come a little bit faster than we thought it would. You know, I think we all like wait for Christmas all year and wait till we can, get new gifts and buy people presents and do service, and then we forget about the rest of the year and it flies by.
Right, exactly. So this is the Cameron Parker Show. You guys can follow the show handle at CP_show. You can follow both of our Twitter handles. You can follow mine at Cameron Parker PO. You can follow CJ at Cal Krainock 21. By the way, you really should make your Twitter handle release the Krainock, or at least you already did the one Twitter handle, which is the Do the CJ, which has garnered so much attention over the past. Okay, I'm lying. It really hasn't garnered hardly anything, but. But you can.
I think that there was a good. That was a couple years ago that caught on a little bit, and there was somebody made a Twitter handle for it and everything, and it was search that hashtag Do the CJ on Instagram or Twitter, and you'll find some of the pictures. They're really funny.
It's just a typical pose, really. I mean, it's just just kind of the typical point to the sky with two hands off to the left and off to the right. It's just a typical pose.
It's a total one of those, just jock poses
right.
that you see on Instagram.
Right, exactly. All right, so we're talking fantasy football, obviously, since it is a Tuesday, and we can jump right into it. But it's going to be a special show. You're going to be actually on for a full show for the first time. And it's a pleasure because of the fact that, the winter meetings are getting ready to start up. And as always, you also provide incredible baseball insight also. So we're going to talk about the Rockies, and we've touched a good length about them, but, with it being the winter meeting starting on Sunday, and I think it's going to be lasting for a few days, so we can kind of talk and kind of pinpoint necessarily truly where the Rockies should go and where does it line up necessarily with the National League West, and things are starting to heat up a little bit, potentially with a team that's in the NL West for a Giancarlo Stanton, so we can talk about a bunch of that. But let's put that on the back burner and let's talk about why you are here, and you are here necessarily to talk some fantasy football, and so one of the topics that I want to start off with first is this topic of Josh Gordon. And Josh Gordon, by fantasy football standards, is one of the top, when he was on the field, was one of the top wide receivers, potentially a wide receiver 1 or 2, potentially in any lineup that you had. And non-football standards, he, by some accounts, could have been a top 3 wide receiver just based off of production. So where exactly is a guy like a Josh Gordon currently, especially since he was just reissued and reinstated off of the commissioner exempt list?
Josh Gordon is one of the more interesting players in fantasy football this year, I believe. And that's because we don't really know. This is somebody that we don't have a lot of information on over the last few years because he's played in very minimal games, and he's played for the Cleveland Browns, who have never had a good quarterback, and he's just kind of gone by the wayside in terms of production, although he has produced, I should say, extraordinarily compared to what we would expect for a Browns receiver when he has been able to play. But we don't know. He hasn't played in however many years, and we don't really know what to expect until we saw him this last Sunday. And I think that it was even more polarizing Josh Gordon than we're used to. And that's because he actually looked good. And they force-fed him the ball. They seemed to target him. I can't even tell you how many times. It seemed like every other play. He had 11 targets, and considering how little they actually throw, 11 targets is a lot. And so they took targets away from Corey Coleman, which is another person that we need to talk about because Corey Coleman was starting to come on, and I don't know if he's fantasy relevant anymore with who they have with Sean Kaiser throwing him the ball. I think that Josh Gordon, for me, if you're in the fantasy playoffs, which is where we're heading this next week, most leagues are going to the first week of fantasy playoffs, I wouldn't recommend starting Josh Gordon. And that's because there's not a whole lot of upside because he's in the Browns offense. There's only a decent amount of upside, not as much as some other offenses. And we don't know. We don't know if he has the conditioning to play back-to-back weeks because he hasn't. We don't know if he is going to be able to handle this target load or if he's, we don't know. So if you're in the fantasy playoffs, chances are you have better options at wide receiver. But if you don't, let's say you had Juju Smith-Schuster who just got suspended for a week and you need a fill-in, he might be a guy you look into for a fill-in for a Juju Smith-Schuster or if you had the injury bug come up last week, whatever, he might be a good fill-in for maybe a week for your fantasy playoffs, but I wouldn't count on starting him every week just because we don't know what level of production we're going to get from him.
If you have any questions, tweet at CJ, at Cal Krainock 21. I haven't gotten any questions so far. Hopefully we can get some questions rolling in the show. You guys can chat, and as our text line, you guys can create a Spreaker account and chime in on the Cameron Parker Show as kind of texters or trying to roll in. Brooks is our more frequent texter, as you would imagine. But yeah, so Josh Gordon, he's been out of the league a few years, and putting it lightly, he's been one of the more top producing wide receivers consistently when he's been on the field from a good length of time. But as you pointed out, he hasn't been on the field for these past 2.5 years, which puts the Cleveland Browns back to where they've historically been in the last 40 years, and that's been the Cleveland Browns. So, I mean, I guess as far as the Corey Coleman dynamic is concerned, he is a decent wide receiver. And I think if you're the Cleveland Browns and if you are trying to go after a quarterback in the draft, which they probably should, and having the number 1 overall pick for the Cleveland Browns' sake, doesn't assure the fact that you're going to end up with the number 1 overall pick. But I think with Deshaun Kaiser, how would you evaluate a quarterback with the Cleveland Browns right now? I mean, just kind of looking at the bird's eye view and maybe objectively, because obviously, as we've outlined before, fantasy quarterbacks or just fantasy football in general, they get looked at differently than than just by, oh, this is one of the better quarterbacks in the National Football League, but he also is not a good fantasy quarterback, kind of just using that comparison a little bit. So how would you grade necessarily a fantasy quarterback for the Cleveland Browns?
Right now, I don't think you're starting Deshaun Kaiser in any formats. But if we're talking about maybe a dynasty league where you're looking towards next year, or you're starting to look towards your next year draft, I think we have some good quarterbacks coming up in this class. A lot of people that I think are, there's a few quarterbacks that some teams are going to be hot on, especially in the top 5 picks. You can expect, maybe the Broncos to be taking a quarterback, the Browns maybe to be taking a quarterback. Really, inside the top 5, most of those teams could use a quarterback. And there are a plethora of quarterbacks in this class. I don't know if, because everybody gets all excited about the first pick, first overall pick in the draft. And assuming that the Browns have that, I don't know how you can get too excited about that this year. And maybe they'll pull a Cleveland Browns and trade out, which I could see happening, trade down in the draft for a team above them that falls in love with somebody, because that seems to be what they've been doing in recent years. But it's hard to fall in love with a guy going to the Cleveland Browns.
Right.
But I think that if Josh Gordon can stay on the field, I think that helps whoever is coming to play quarterback for the Browns next year, whether it still be Deshaun Kaiser or whether they draft somebody or throw money at whoever in free agency. I think if Josh Gordon can stay on the field and Corey Coleman can line up on the other side, David Njoku is a good tight end receiver, and I think especially if Joe Thomas comes back from injury, then that starts to look like a place that's not so bad for a new quarterback to land.
Well, and I mean, overall, based on paper, they at least tried their darndest to re-upgrade the position, the offensive line, in the offseason. With Batonio, I believe, and a bunch of other guys certainly on that offensive line. So they did, and Cleveland certainly is trying to do it the right way, necessarily the Dallas way, and that's to build a stable offensive line and then have the other pieces follow. And by decent standards, they did have a pretty good first-round draft last year. I mean, they came away with 3 picks, necessarily. Then, obviously, the Deshaun Kaiser pick didn't necessarily pan out here this year, but Jabril Peppers is a tremendous athlete as a safety, maybe a corner if they need be. This David Njoku is is that maybe hybrid tight end wide receiver as we just were talking about earlier. So, I mean, Cleveland, I think, is getting there as far as the pieces, but for some reason it all has hinged on getting a stable quarterback, and who knows if they will, because, Sam Darnold, it's been reported that if he does come out, he does not want to play for the Cleveland Browns. At least that's what he said, and that he would like to be with the Giants, or, as I've said, that let's just say the Broncos are sneaking their way into the top 2, which appears incredibly likely that the Broncos are creeping up to the number 2 spot. I would almost be considered, if I'm Darnold, to come out. And maybe let's kind of transition a little bit to a different topic. And since we're talking about college quarterbacks, and I don't know how much homework necessarily you've done it as far as fantasy quarterbacks, but I mean, you look at some of those guys like a Josh Rosen, a Sam Darnold, a Josh Allen, a Baker Mayfield, a Lamar Jackson. Who could potentially be a fantasy darling in that rookie class?
I think that's a really interesting question, and the answer, if you're looking at like a dynasty league, and not in a one year league, your answer to this question is going to be completely different. And I think if you're looking at a redraft league that's going to last 1 year, and you are thinking about drafting a rookie quarterback next year, maybe as your second quarterback, or if you wait on a quarterback in the draft next year, in your fantasy draft, then you're looking at historically there's been only a couple kinds of quarterbacks that have big-time rookie years. And I think one of those is the supporting cast quarterback. So you have the guy that gets plugged into a really good system like Dak Prescott, a good system with good players around him who make plays with a coach that will call to his strong suits. And I think that's easier to identify than we think. I think nobody could argue the fact that Dak Prescott was going to have one of the best offensive lines in football, and that Ezekiel Elliott wasn't going to be a stud. There's not very many people that would have told you those things weren't true.
Right.
And so he was going into a good situation. Dak Prescott had a great rookie year for fantasy football.
He won Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, exactly. And then the quarterback who transcends the game of football. Okay, so you look at other rookie quarterbacks that have had big rookie years fantasy-wise. You think of RG3, Colin Kaepernick, guys that were not, they weren't a mold. Cam Newton, yeah. They were not a mold. They were not, a pocket passing quarterback that they plugged into a bad team, and that the reason that they were on the bad team was because obviously if you have the first overall pick, you're usually going to go to a bad team. Now this wasn't, but they transcended the game, and they did it with their legs, or they added an element that the quarterback position hasn't really seen before. And they had a coach that was willing to build a system around them. RG3 had the zone read. So did Colin Kaepernick. I always think of the game where he shredded the Packers in the playoffs. I think he had almost 200 yards rushing. And I can't even stop thinking about that just because it was so different. They'd done it in college, but nobody had ever tried that in the NFL before. And so you look at somebody next year, you think of people that can do that. And I look at Lamar Jackson, who is that different kind of talent. And then I think whoever is lucky enough to get drafted into a good system with a good people around them. And so I think that if the Broncos upgrade their offensive line in free agency, you're looking at whoever the next Broncos quarterback is, because they'll be thrown to Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. And maybe even look at the Browns, like we were talking about, because if Joe Thomas comes back, they've got a good offensive line. With Josh Gordon and Corey Coleman, they've got two pretty good receivers. David Njoku's a good tight end. They've got some playmakers around him. Maybe, if they take like a Baker Mayfield, I would have a hard time not picking him. And he's the kind of guy that Cleveland needs. So you look at fit when you're doing redraft leagues. But if you're doing a dynasty league, I think you're drafting on talent at that point, because you're going to have that player forever, his whole career, if you plan on staying in your dynasty league. At that point, you look at scouting reports and just pick who you think is the most talented and more likely to come out. Because we've seen that, people like Peyton Manning didn't have the greatest rookie year. Tom Brady didn't have the greatest rookie year for a couple games at the beginning. But those were the talented guys. So if you're in redraft leagues, you're looking for fit. If you're in dynasty leagues, you're looking for talent.
Well, and I think that for me, people will always look at Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold. And I think that maybe more so based off of history. I'm surprised you didn't say the other team that could potentially be in there. But I think as far as the teams that could potentially be in that top 5, I think of the Giants as another team. You think of those guys like a Lamar Jackson, and I can say it now, but I'm more biased to a Lamar Jackson right now as far as my top pick. However, Sam Darnold, in essence, kind of is changing that potential viewpoint, is maybe that Sam Darnold is probably the best quarterback between all of them right now, but Lamar Jackson just kind of is that interesting guy, and maybe it's just because of us as people and as evaluators, especially myself, that I gravitate to more of those freakish athletes necessarily. So guys like a Lamar Jackson, a Baker Mayfield, or a Josh Allen. Guys that are, for Josh Allen's sake, he's incredibly big, and he's very hard to bring down. And there are maybe some similarities between he and Paxton Lynch when he is coming out as far as being a project. And this isn't really a fantasy, maybe a discussion, but it's just more of like top quarterback necessarily. But still, Lamar Jackson's kind of that interesting breed necessarily, to the point where at the same time, if he gets his arm together, and by all indications and everything that I've heard from scouts and everything from sources that I've talked to, everything that I've heard is that he's gotten better every single year. He's been with the quarterback coach, and so he's gotten better. And I think that bodes exceptionally well going into the National Football League, where supposedly you're going to have better coaches, you're going to have better people that's going to work around you. And if you're with the Denver Broncos, you are going to have a lot of people around you, potentially, that is going to help you in your rookie season. Demaryius Thomas, we mentioned, Emmanuel Sanders, not even to mention Jake Butt, potentially, who could be healthy coming into next year. So I think that, as far as that is concerned, trying to figure out potentially a fantasy quarterback in this upcoming year. We could talk about it more, obviously, next year, with it being April, and, kind of pinpointing necessarily mock drafts and everything, and maybe talk about it more as far as fantasy quarterbacks, because by that point, the NFL Combine is coming out. We don't know. We will have officially known after that whose stock is high, whose stock is low, all that kind of thing. So let's talk a little bit now as far as your starts and sits necessarily for the week and potentially the Thursday night game.
Okay. So this Thursday night game is the Saints and Falcons, for anybody that didn't know. And man, there's a lot of starts in this game, which is funny because last time I was on this show, we talked about how many sits there were for the Thursday night game with the Cowboys and the Redskins. And the Cowboys ended up going off. Alfred Morris did great, better than I thought he would. But the Saints, man, if I own a Saint, I'm probably starting him for the Thursday night game. So Drew Brees, actually, it's funny because Drew Brees, when you talk about the Saints and must starts, you would normally think about Drew Brees, but I think that he's one of the iffy ones, that he's going to be around quarterback, 8 to 10 for me. You might have a better option depending on how you draft it. But Saints running backs, they're a go every week. They've proven that they're both top 5 running backs. So if you have a Saints running back, you're playing him. If you have Michael Thomas, you're playing him. If you have Julio Jones, you're playing him. I don't think there are a lot of sits in this game. However, I would look at Matt Ryan and say that the Saints historically, the Saints have never really had a great defense, but this year is a little bit different, and on Thursday night games, we tend to see lower scoring because of the lack of preparation on offense, the lack of time. So I might stray away from Matt Ryan if you have a better option this week. But as far as Thursday night game, a lot of starts for me.
All right. Now, as far as some potential players for this upcoming weekend that are players that are your potential love-hate, to kind of piggyback off of Matthew Berry and take what he says. Who are some of your players this weekend?
I love me some Brett Hundley this week. And that is not my Packers bias showing, because I wish Aaron Rodgers was out there more than anybody. But they're playing the Browns on Sunday, and this is a game that they have to win because Aaron Rodgers has the potential of coming back next week. He's going to be eligible to be reinstated off the IR next week, and if they win this game, then they are in the playoff hunt, which they're not out of it right now. If they win this week, they're right in the thick of things. The Browns have an above-average run defense, even though I love me some Jamal Williams. Dude's a stud.
Played really well last week.
What was that?
He played really well last week. He had, I think, his first 100-yard game.
Yeah, and I'm telling you, I've seen this kid play. I went to school with him. When my senior year in high school, I transferred up and I took some classes at BYU, and that was his first year, and he was 17 years old and the starting running back for BYU. And that guy, he's legit. So I love me some Jamal Williams, but this week it's going to be tough sledding because the Browns do have an underrated run defense, and so. But the pass defense is nothing special, which is why they can't win any games. So I love me some Brett Hundley this week. I think that he's a good play if you've got one of these middling quarterbacks. I think that Brett Hundley's a good play. I don't love me. I hate me some Cam Newton this week, playing the Vikings defense. Cam, again, has just been inconsistent, and I do want to say I had the same exact shoulder injury that Cam Newton had, and I've had surgery on my shoulder a couple times. And so I can, as a baseball player, I threw a lot, and I can definitely relate to Cam Newton and how he's feeling after this surgery. You're going to have some inaccuracy issues, especially week to week. It's going to seem very inconsistent just because you're almost teaching yourself how to throw again. Your muscle memory, it just isn't quite the same. The ball doesn't go exactly where you want it to anymore. And you have to learn to live with that. And then especially playing football, as you get hit, things start to get sore. It changes a little bit from week to week. The Vikings defense is good, so I'm probably straying away from Cam Newton. But I love me some Christian McCaffrey, always, just because I think he's starting to take some more touches from Jonathan Stewart, and they're going to start getting more involved. You're going to see some more checkdowns against the Vikings. So I love me some Christian McCaffrey, hate Cam Newton. I love me some Jimmy G. Jimmy Garoppolo going up against the Texans. Texans defense is awful. If you have a middling quarterback, maybe you throw Jimmy G in there. He can give you, I bet you somewhere in the low 200 yards, 1 or 2 touchdowns this week. So if you just need someone to get you by, check out Jimmy Garoppolo. And then always Cooper Kupp. Give me some Cooper Kupp.
The best cup is the Cooper Kupp.
What's that?
I said the best cup is the Cooper Kupp.
That's absolutely right. And going up against the Eagles, I imagine the Rams' defense is going to give up a lot of points. If they're going to stay in it, they're going to have to score. Carson Wentz is not going to settle for the output that they had this last week. So if they're going to keep up, they're going to have to throw it. Cooper Kupp's the guy. He's the dude. So give me some Cooper Kupp.
All right, that was the fantasy segment, necessarily, of the Fantasy Gurus, as always. I got to ask you, you said you play baseball, and you've obviously shown tremendous amount of insight being a fantasy guru, so do a little play on words there. Do you have a preference when it comes to trying to break down baseball versus fantasy football or just fantasy sports in general? Do you have a preference?
I think I like fantasy football better, but I like baseball, the sport, better. I love baseball, and I love being at games, and I love the atmosphere, and there's so many great things about baseball, about the game of baseball. And I like the sport a lot, but I think fantasy football I enjoy more than fantasy baseball. It's less tedious. You only have to set your lineup once a week instead of every day for 6 or 7 months. I like fantasy football more, but I love talking baseball. I love coaching baseball. I just accepted recently. Well, I shouldn't say I've accepted yet, but been offered a job as a baseball coach for a high school here where I live, and I'm probably going to say yes and do that.
Well, clearly you said yes. You said you accepted, so I mean.
I got to talk to my wife. I haven't accepted. I don't know if my wife has accepted.
That's the point. That's the key point right there.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I love the sport of baseball, but I think I like fantasy football better as far as fantasy sports.
Well, that takes us into our baseball discussion. Now, the winter meetings are getting ready to tee off on Sunday. We spent at length talking about Shohei Ohtani and where the Colorado Rockies should go. You know what's interesting? Talking about Shohei Ohtani, I am really surprised with him, and I think that this is why I'm surprised that I haven't heard rumors swirling necessarily of the Rockies being interested. I was really surprised. I don't know about you, but I was really surprised and actually thankful that a guy coming from Japan actually has a brain that's understanding I don't really necessarily care who I want to play for, and I have necessarily my eyes necessarily early on being set on going to a small market team. And I think that that's been kind of the more surprising and maybe refreshing point in the whole Shohei Ohtani news that's been coming out.
Yeah, I think that you look at him and you see somebody that can think for themselves, which is odd in athletics. And I think that he's just, yeah, like you said, he said that the Yankees and the Red Sox are no longer on his list, which are they're the two biggest markets right there, and that he wants to play for a small market team and that he would like to play preferably near the West Coast. And I think it's throwing a lot of baseball analysts off. Like, wait, he doesn't want the money. He doesn't want the fame. He just wants to play baseball. And I love that. That's what you want out of a baseball player. It's just somebody who wants to play baseball. Doesn't care where it is. He wants to be close to family. I assume that's why he wants to be on the West Coast. It's a shorter flight to Japan. And he doesn't care about the fame or the fortune. He's getting it already just by being who he is.
Right.
But it makes you think that, man, maybe he's serious about pitching and hitting, and not just because he wants to be the first MLB pitcher hitter, of this age at least, to do it successfully.
Well,
I don't think that's it for him.
No, and I think that it's just, like I said, it's refreshing that a player of that caliber coming from Japan, because I think it's safe to say, and there's pitchers all the time that transport themselves from Japan over to the majors that have been fairly successful. I mean, you look at Masahiro Tanaka and obviously Yu Darvish, at least of the current people that have done it, and they've been fairly successful. And so I think that the only thing that's different necessarily is obviously that he's a hitter. And we kind of outlined, and of the core necessarily that could potentially be interested, the only team maybe, and I was kind of hearing it be discussed as I was watching MLB Network before we went live. But I think that if you are looking at it from the small market variety, a National League West team like the San Diego Padres might potentially be a very interesting team that could look at Shohei Ohtani and say, why don't you come and potentially be a pitcher and a hitter if you're in the National League side? And I think that because of that, while you're in a pitcher's ballpark, it's very beneficial. Now, the hitting side could potentially be a little bit tricky because you're in a pitcher's ballpark. So, because, well, as we outlined earlier, he might want to be closer to home. And of all the places that could be closest to home, it would be the state of California. The state of California.
Mm-hmm. Or Washington. And, so I think right now he's got to go to the Mariners, right?
Well, yeah, and I think Mariners, Rangers. And that Rangers is probably the team that I would say should go after him the hardest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the Mariners are an interesting prospect. I think, you look at a couple years ago, they threw a lot of money around to towards people like Robinson Cano, and everyone thought that the Mariners were going to be this team to beat, and then they haven't made the playoffs since then. And they're an interesting team. I wonder if Ohtani will look at that and say they can't win. And if he's really that focused on just the game of baseball, the Rangers have more history with that, I think. But at the same time, the Mariners also have a history with good Japanese players, with Ichiro. So I see a lot of different things. I think you're right. I think it comes down to the Mariners and the Rangers, maybe the Angels.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about the Angels in there, too.
Yeah, being in the mix there. But those aren't the teams that we expected him to be interested in. And so it's very interesting is not even the right word to use. It's just been a very unique
It's just
process.
odd, yeah. Yeah.
What was that?
It's just odd. Just very odd.
Yeah, it's catching everybody off guard. Like, I don't even know how to analyze it, which for him, he's good for him. He's doing what he believes in, is what it seems like, and where he thinks he can be successful and where he'll be comfortable. And if I'm a team, I look at that and say, you just have to respect it. You have to respect it, and you have to, if you're going to vie for his services, you have to convince him that comfort is what you're going to give him. So, I think the Rangers can appeal to that, and we'll see. But I think right now the Mariners are the favorites. But we could have said, a couple weeks ago, I would have told you there's no way he doesn't go to the Yankees.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know. We'll see what he ends up doing when his list gets a little bit more extensive of, because he released a list of teams that he wasn't interested in.
Right.
He even went on an interview and kind of dissed the Phillies pretty badly. I don't know if you saw that, but they said that he was going to go visit Philadelphia, and they said, there's a baseball team in Philadelphia. He's like, no, I'm just going there to sightsee.
Right.
So he's not interested in the Phillies. He's brought out this list of teams he doesn't want to play for, and as that gets bigger, then we'll see where he ends up. But I'm really intrigued. He's not going for the superstar look, I don't think, but he's starting to act like, he knows what he wants, and
yeah,
he's going to get that superstar treatment no matter where he goes.
Once the Shohei Ohtani and Giancarlo Stanton, those dominoes fall, we're going to see a lot of moves happen, whether that's the bullpen, whether that's other big bats. And certainly for the Rockies' sake, wanting to go after a big bat is a priority. And, Bridich came out and said that it's not the biggest priority, obviously revamping the bullpen, and he said catching is certainly a priority, which should be a priority because of how Jonathan Lucroy, he established that rapport with the staff. So re-signing, Lucroy should be a priority. Now, as far as the relievers, we touched a little bit on it. They're interested in Zach Britton potentially as a trade candidate, and Greg Holland. And I was talking to some people, as far as some of the sources that I at least have knowledge of, and I heard that Jose Reyes' contract comes off the books this year. So, and obviously they have the TV deal, and I don't exactly know potentially where that fits in as far as the money to spend, but it's going to be a lot. So I do foresee some huge moves potentially happening for the Rockies. And I think that, let's just say for the sake of marriage, that they re-sign Greg Holland. I really do think that it's not out of the realm of possibility that they bring back Greg Holland's former teammate and, I should say, familiarity with Steve Foster, Wade Davis. And that would be, as far as, with what they had with Pat Neshek, last year, I would say that just those two guys in general would be better than what they had last year.
Yeah, I think so too. And you add those two guys to the back of the pen, maybe one more stud if they. I can only imagine if they got Britton also.
I know.
Then you're starting to look like a Yankees bullpen out there, and that can win you a lot of games. If you can get a lead going into the sixth, or like the Yankees the last few years, get a lead going into the 6th inning, and it's pretty much over. I really like that approach for the Rockies. But, like we've talked about, I think they're also a starter away, and maybe one they could use a bat at first base, maybe, that we've talked about, and we'll see what they want to spend. But the shoring up the back end of that bullpen is huge for them, and I think that us as fans are going to be really excited to see them pulling off moves like that we're not really used to seeing from the Rockies. It's going to be more exciting.
Well, yeah, and I was talking to a friend of mine and he put up a good point, and it's exactly kind of what we just talked about right there. He said it is great now knowing the fact that the Rockies are attached to free agents like this. Because over the years, they're attached to free agents like this, but they're 36, 37 years old and past their prime, and this is basically just to put kind of fans in the seats necessarily. That kind of move. Well, now, because the Rockies were 87 and 75 and actually made the postseason and got ousted, but we're also really close to coming back and actually winning that game. Because honestly, if I was to tell you that if Greg Holland, strikes out Archie Bradley or AJ Pollock, I would say the Rockies actually have a legitimate chance of winning that game based on how they were coming back and fighting, and I think tying up the game twice necessarily, or becoming at least very close to one run from tying the Arizona Diamondbacks. I would say they had a better chance potentially of winning that game, but also, as we outlined, that game proved that they really do need a starting pitcher, and whether they consider re-signing Tyler Chatwood back or really going for it and getting a guy like a Jake Arrieta, or setting their sights on potentially getting a guy like a Chris Archer. And I think that, and maybe that to me is the point necessarily for the Rockies, that if you're going to go after a guy like a Jake Arrieta, just go after it and ask around necessarily for the potential availability of a guy like a Marcus Stroman, who you've been interested in last year, and also Chris Archer. I mean, if you're going to be interested in a guy like a Jake Arrieta, just do it necessarily, you know what I mean? And so I think that, for the Rockies, it becomes that gray area because of the point that, well, you have a lot of moves to spend, and the thing with the Rockies is, and especially with Bridich, he is so close to the vest, and as far as what we have no idea that they're going to go after. I mean, who knew that the Rockies were going to sign Ian Desmond last year? I mean, because people were all throwing out, first base names like Jose Abreu again, and, Mark Trumbo necessarily, and so I think that Chris Carter was kind of an under-the-radar option potentially for the Rockies. So we have no idea potentially of where the Rockies could go. Obviously, as we've said, Jonathan Lucroy should be one of the top priorities. But I do think, based off of that wild card game against the Diamondbacks, getting a legitimate starting pitcher should be of the priority. But it's kind of that it's kind of that twofold. Is it starting pitching or is it the bullpen? Because if you manage, let's just say, to do the impossible and sign Wayne Davis and sign Greg Holland and also trade for Zach Britton, boy, that's impressive. Because you're looking at the case of, if they do trade for Zach Britton, what kind of package could you potentially send to the Baltimore Orioles? I mean, because you'd be looking at maybe an active player, a starting player, and potentially 2 prospects, potentially, for Zach Britton.
Yeah, and that's a big asking price, and I wonder if they won't just go for one of these guys, re-sign Holland, and try to go for an under the radar signing like Holland was last year, which would make a lot of sense for the Rockies to do that move instead of try to get them all, and try to do it that way. Because if you have the 2 shutdown guys at the back of the pen, that's going to be good enough for you. The third is just a sweetener, and so maybe they try to go for an under the radar move for that third guy.
You know, it's
But-
interesting. I was just going to
Go
say, of all they were attached to Britton at the MLB trade deadline, but it's interesting. You know, Britton has been subject of trade rumors since that MLB trade deadline with the Dodgers and the Diamondbacks. You know, potentially of teams being interested in him. But ever since the winter meetings began, you know, I haven't been catching up necessarily watching MLB Network or MLB Tonight. You know, watching Ken Rosenthal and John Morosi break it down. But as far as a tweet necessarily that I've seen, and Zach Britton, the Rockies were the only known team out in public that are talking to the Orioles about Zach Britton. So does that mean that the Rockies are the only legitimate threat right now that could land Zach Britton? I don't know. But I just found that kind of very odd, potentially, for the Rockies and Zach Britton pairing and kind of that whole diatribe necessarily.
Yeah, well, I think you have to look within your own division if you're the Rockies, and look at what you're up against. The Diamondbacks the bullpen was their Achilles heel. They could hit the cover off the ball. They had good starting pitching, but the bullpen would throw games for them. And then you have the Dodgers in there too, and that makes you think that there's a really good chance that no matter what moves you pull over this offseason, that you're probably going to be playing for the wild card next year because of the Dodgers and them bringing back so many people on their team and their willingness to keep spending money. So it makes you think that you're going to have to play in this wild card game, and you're going to need a guy that can a shutdown guy, and I mean a starter that's going to win you one game to get you into the series, because I think that the Rockies can hang with the Dodgers in a series, but I don't know if they can hang with Clayton Kershaw for one game. You know, I don't know if they can outpitch Clayton Kershaw in a one-game series. I don't know if they can outpitch Zach Greinke in a one-game series.
Well, I was going to say,
They just don't have that guy.
Well, I was going to say, let's look at it. You know, I called up the potential free agents necessarily. Former Rocky, Brett Anderson, is a free agent. Jake Arrieta is a free agent. Bronson Arroyo is a free agent. I mean, there are some decent guys that are out there. Clay Buchholz is out there, but he hasn't been the exact same player. You can attest to that, you know, being a Red Sox follower. Trevor Cahill is kind of maybe an interesting guy. Andrew Kashner potentially, you know, with the sinker ball and the fast and that fast fastball, I should say, that he has. Alex Cobb, interestingly enough, is a very interesting guy. Yu Darvish for when he was with the Dodgers. Let's see, I think Giovanni Gallardo potentially. Matt Garza has been thrown around potentially as a potentially with the Rockies before. The guy that I think that could, and Doug Fister actually was one of the guys that I thought potentially could have been an interest for the Rockies. The guy, though, that I think could be very interesting for the Rockies, and I talked to Troy Renck about it, was a guy by the name of Tyson Ross. And people are probably going to say, Tyson Ross? Who's Tyson Ross? Well, you know, you think back to the days of when Bud Black was with the San Diego Padres, and they were shipping their starting pitching off left and right. Tyson Ross was one of the more stable starting pitching, starting pitchers potentially on that rotation. And he was getting really, really good. Now, it was San Diego, so we need to take that into account, much like the bias potentially of Coors Field. But I think that Tyson Ross could potentially be a very interesting guy for the Rockies.
Yeah, I like Tyson Ross a lot, actually. I'm in a couple... Let's talk about fantasy sports again. I'm in a couple dynasty baseball leagues where I've gone up and picked him up and just stashed him on my injured reserves all year when he was hurt, trying to hope that he'd come back to form. Because when he's on, this is the kind of under-the-radar signing the Rockies need. is a guy that is not going to demand a whole lot free agency because of the injury history, but has the potential to be a total stud. And if he's not, then you throw him in the bullpen, or he's going to be a number 4 or 5 starter, and oh well. He's not. It didn't cost you that much anyway. But Tyson Ross has the potential to be a really good number 2 starter, almost an ace, if he's healthy. We don't know how he's going to bounce back. He had a neck injury last year. He had a shoulder injury the year before that. But this is kind of like the Greg Holland situation, where you're targeting a guy coming off an injury that has a lot of potential, and if he turns it around for you, you're going to look real good. And if he doesn't, well, then it was an under-the-radar signing anyway, so it doesn't matter.
What do you about
So I really like that.
what do you think about a guy like a Chris Tillman? Is Chris Tillman kind of maybe teetering now as far as age?
Yes, and I don't know, you look at guys that used to be really big, top prospects that didn't really, turn into what everyone hoped they would. There's always some potential there, but I think if you're the Rockies, a name like that is not. That's not what I want our signing to be this offseason. If we go for Tyson Ross, even that can't be it. I'm biased because I want Jake Arrieta so bad.
I know.
To be a Rocky. But, you can, maybe Chris Tillman could, I think he'll end up being a back of the rotation guy. Maybe you could throw him in the bullpen. He throws hard,
Right.
But I just don't see that as what the Rockies need. I see that as what the Rockies have always done, and I don't think that's what they need right now.
Let's go to first base, because what's interesting about first base necessarily is there are, we talked about at length, Eric Hosmer, and rightfully so, because he's the prize of all the first base prospects necessarily that's out there. He is the cherry on top. Matt Adams is a really interesting guy. He played with a really crappy Braves team. Although I say crappy, but they played okay last year. But Matt Adams was a guy that, you go back a few years back when the Rockies had Troy Tulowitzki, and they had potentially, you and I talked about that too, the potential deal that they probably should have taken with Troy Tulowitzki on that Rockies roster. When the Cardinals had offered Trevor Rosenthal, Matt Adams, and I think they offered Shelby Miller, but they wanted Michael Wacha. And obviously the Rockies turned him down. But Matt Adams was potentially in that deal, or at least the Rockies wanted Matt Adams, and at that point in time the Cardinals didn't want to get rid of him. But Matt Adams, I think, is a really interesting guy, potentially, if you want to put him in Coors Field.
Yeah, Matt Adams is a guy who's been on some teams that have had some success, and he's been linked to some bigger names. I'm looking up right now how there's been a lot of beat writers that are begging the Red Sox to get in on him, and some other big teams like that. He's a career .271 hitter. He strikes out a lot, but who doesn't now?
Fits the Colorado mold.
Yeah, and he's got a lot of home run upside. You put him in Coors Field, and there you go. That's a signing for first base I would love to see, because I don't know if we need a big money bat in that lineup because it's already so good.
Mm-hmm.
But he would still be a solid addition and could play well defensively at first.
Well, and maybe, and I got to check his age, but maybe this could potentially be the year where you look at, and obviously they were attached to Jay Bruce, and Brooks and I were talking, because we always talk sports, right? We always talk baseball necessarily when it's the three of us. Obviously they were attached to Jay Bruce. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. I mean, he is okay necessarily at first base. He's not the best. And I think that would almost entail that they would want to play him at first base because of the outfield that they necessarily have or could have, with Ian Desmond potentially moving in the outfield, potentially. So I think that for Jay Bruce, it would be a very interesting move Because at least historically, you think of the top 10 clutch hitters in Major League Baseball over a 5-6 year span when he was with the Cincinnati Reds. Jay Bruce was one of the top performers in that regard. So it's kind of a very interesting move. And we talked about Matt Adams, but it could be that under the radar move for the Rockies is getting a guy like a Jay Bruce.
Yeah, what I really like for the Rockies is if they would look at a platoon guy with some good splits against left and right-handed pitching to complement Desmond. Because if you're going to use Desmond and his versatility, which is part of the reason they said they signed him in the first place,
right?
Then if you have a guy that can play first base against, lefties or righties or whatever, and you can plug Desmond into left, and then you can bench whoever's in left, but then when you have a righty, then you bench Adams, and you bring up Tapia to play left or whoever, right? I think that's the cheapest, best option for the Rockies because of the versatility of Desmond. And I don't know what Jay Bruce's splits are. That would be interesting to look at. We can talk about next time. But I think if you're the Rockies, you don't need somebody that's crazy expensive. So let's look at somebody who can, that can split time with Desmond at first, and then we can also put him in left. And I don't know what you think about that, but I think that would be the best way to open up money for the pitching.
Yeah, and obviously the trade talk of Jose Abreu, it's all fun and good. It is. It's just all fun to nicely attach the Rockies to Jose Abreu because it's been that way for the last 3 or 4 years that they've been interested in him. And, you think of if they really wanted to go hard after a first base, well, then we would have already known by now that first base is their priority. I mean, it's a priority, but as it's been clearly established, it's not the priority. And then you go into the catching, the catchers that are potential free agents, and there's some interesting ones out there. I mean, Tim Fedorowicz, AJ Ellis. AJ Ellis is probably one of the more pitcher-savvy catchers and maybe an underappreciated hitter, but he's not the same guy, not the same catcher that he was with the Los Angeles Dodgers. Nick Hundley is a free agent. Former Rocky Chris Iannetta is a free agent. I'm surprised he's lasted as long as he has.
Well, and former Rocky, Nick Hundley was a former Rocky too.
Yeah.
A lot of former Rocky catchers.
Miguel Montero.
Bring them all back.
Right.
Bring them all back. Platoon them all.
Obviously, Jonathan Lucroy potentially. Carlos Ruiz is interesting because, he's getting up there in age, so you would potentially sign him to a 1-year contract. They actually wanted Carlos Ruiz, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3 years ago. And I think he had a contract on the table for the Colorado Rockies, but I think he turned it down and went to re-sign with the Phillies, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so I think of the core, Jonathan Lucroy is their best bet. Jose Lobaton might be an interesting one.
He was an all-star a couple of years ago.
I don't see them going after Ryan Hannigan again, because I think that at some point they do want to see what they have in Walters and Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it is Jonathan Lucroy for them. I think you have to sign him if you can get, let's throw out a number. If you want to sign him to maybe the Gerardo Parra deal that you signed Parra to, which is the 3-year, I think was a 3-year, $30 million dollar deal or something along those lines, but $10 million per. If you can get him to sign a deal quite like that, it's still going to free up a good amount of money potentially for a bullpen arm. That'll bring you in a guy like a Wade Davis, and if you want to, you're going to be a fan of this deal. But let's just say that if you're Baltimore and they've struggled in essence to try and find some infield consistency because it's been so unpredictable, what if the Rockies wanted to throw in a guy like a DJ LeMahieu? And
send him wherever else.
Right. You want to package maybe a DJ LeMahieu, put him in, and then maybe throw in, I don't know, Ryan McMahon, and then potentially another arm, and maybe see where it goes. I think the one thing that I am starting to understand, and I probably should have a long time ago, is that if you replace a good hitter, and DJ LeMahieu's proven to be a really good hitter, you're going to still get a really good hitter with the Rockies. And Trevor Story, I think, he's proven to be at least a good hitter when he's on his game. If he establishes his strike zone and where it is, I think he's going to be a really good shortstop because his defense has come along well. And they obviously still want to see what they have in Brendan Rodgers. So do they decide to trade a DJ LeMahieu, move Trevor Story to second, and then call up the kid to play shortstop? I think that's an alternative that, frankly, I would not be opposed to. And I love DJ LeMahieu. You've heard me praise DJ LeMahieu before. But as far as wanting to upgrade pitching and upgrade something and potentially even make it better, I actually wouldn't be opposed to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that'd be a great trade just because of who you've got sitting down there, and like you were just saying, McMahon is probably, there's probably not going to be a spot for him, but he's going to be trade bait. Great prospect. But Rodgers, he's in the top 10, 20 prospects, has been since he got drafted, and he's looked better at every stop along the way. I think he's going to be a great player, and so the only way to find out is to plug him in. He's blocked right now by Story and LeMahieu, and I could see them trading Trevor Story too, but either one of those guys I could see flipping for either bullpen or a starter, and I wouldn't be mad about it.
Fact of the matter is, I see Brendan Rodgers coming up to the Rockies this year, at least not this year, but in 2018, just because history has shown itself. At least when Brendan Rodgers has been in the minor leagues, he's already in Double-A for crying out loud. I mean, in the minor leagues, you have rookie ball, and then you have A ball, and then high A ball, and then you go into Double-A. He's already into Double-A, and he's like 20 years old. So that just shows you as far as his development and how far he's come as young as he is. So he is coming, and it's just a matter of time for the Rockies to actually say and pull the plug. Let's call up the kid. Let's bring him in here to spring training. Let's see if he can hit professional hitters and see where it goes. Because who knows, we might look at a scenario like Trevor Story did in spring training 2 years ago. I mean, you look at Christian Adames. Obviously, Christian Adames didn't fare well. But Christian Adames, one could say, would have been the starting shortstop if Trevor Story didn't hit the lights out of the ball in spring training. And because Trevor Story hit the lights out of the ball in spring training, he developed his glove. They showed a lot of confidence in him. He became quite reliable as a shortstop defensively. And one would argue he should have been a Gold Glove candidate. So I think that, it might be an option to consider if you're the Rockies.
Yeah, absolutely. And if he's that good, he's going to show it in spring training, and maybe you make a little, a veteran move to fill in a gap if you trade Story or LeMahieu and sign somebody to a 1-year contract who's, I think you just said Jose Reyes even. His contract is up. I'm not sure if that means he's a free agent or not, but even you could sign somebody like that for your deal and have him compete with Rodgers when he's coming up. And, I think that'd be beneficial. Give some competition. They'll put in a stopgap, trade for a piece that you need, and then I think they're a contender.
Last little point, and then we'll finish up the show. Let's talk about the relief pitchers. We talked a little bit about it. The relief is their number one potential target if you're the Rockies. There are some interesting names out there. Matt Belisle, he's getting up there in age. Just as far as familiarity, does he want to come back to Colorado? I know he's come out and said that he loves Colorado. Brandon Kinsler has been thrown around as a potential option for the Rockies. Craig Breslow of the Cleveland powerhouse bullpen, is an option. so there are some interesting guys, that could be of interest for him. I think Addison Reed might be an interesting one for the Rockies. Potentially Jason Grilly, not to go a little old-fashioned and another old age guy, but Grilly's shown the propensity ever since he's left Colorado to be a really good bullpen norm, and so I think that Grilly might be a potential guy. Obviously, you look at Greg Holland, so there are some interesting guys out there. Luke Gregerson, for that matter, is an interesting option.
Yeah, I like the idea of getting one of these guys that was a closer this year for another team that maybe was filling in, like Addison Reed for the Mets, Kinsler for the Twins. I like adding that to your bullpen because that person was entrusted with that closer position because they've got the moxie, the power, the mental fortitude to hold down the ninth inning. And I don't think that's ever a bad thing to add to your bullpen. And so I would love it if they made a move like that, and maybe a trade for Britton or signing back Holland. I think that's where we need to go. And just to get some grit back to the bullpen, of just some shutdown attitude, so that your team knows that when you get to the 6th, 7th inning, the game is over. You add that, and I think that the Rockies are going to be a real threat.
Let's go and just play crystal ball as we head into the winter meetings. We can potentially recap maybe some of the moves that happen in the span of a few days on that Tuesday, next Tuesday. But what do you think happens? I mean, if you're the Rockies and you're trying to predict a move or two, what moves could you potentially see for the Rockies in that span? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, the winter meetings go from like the 10th to the 14th or 15th.
I think that by next Tuesday when we talk, I doubt much has happened with the Rockies because I think you're going to see the Giancarlo domino fall, and then maybe Ohtani. That talk's going to pick up, or if he picks a destination by that point, and those are going to be the big names that you see. And then I think it gets interesting. I hope that the Rockies, and I think that they do. I hope that they do it. I hope that they surprise us and go in on a name like Arrieta. I don't know if they get him, but I hope they at least try. But I see them bullpen being the major names, bullpen Lucroy, and trying to sign back Holland being the big things that we see in the winter meetings, which don't seem so exciting, but I think that they'll be big.
It's still it's still a smart move.
Yeah, I think they'll make the smart move, and hopefully they don't surprise us by throwing a ton of money at another bat and letting some bullpen guys walk. But I don't think that'll happen. I think that they know what their weakness was in that bullpen. I think that's what we see get fixed.
I think for me, if the Rockies, and if I'm making a prediction, I would say maybe right now, I would say Wade Davis has a good opportunity to be a Rocky. And if they can make Wade Davis a Rocky, they re-sign Greg Holland and Jonathan Lucroy, I would say that's a pretty successful Christmas for the Colorado Rockies.
Yep, I agree.
And so we'll see if they do that, even if they don't get a Jake Arrieta. But I think it still would be beneficial for the Rockies to at least consider all options, consider starting pitching, reiterating exactly what you said. They are interested in Jake Arrieta. It's just a matter of can they pry him to Colorado and convince him that not only can he hit dingers in Colorado like John Gray did, the 465-foot shot that he did to center field, but he now has the sights of potentially helping out a young veteran, a young pitching rotation. So we'll see what happens, and by Tuesday we'll be able to recap potentially maybe even some moves. I think as far as predicting, and this is non-Rockies, I say the Ohtani news will come before Stanton.
Yeah, and maybe it does. I kind of hope it does because I think that's what I'm more excited about than the Stanton news. Just because we've been so confused by all this, I'd love to see that fall as soon as possible.
Yeah. Well, CJ, thank you very much, man, for tuning in and being on for a full show, and we'll see if you're up for it. I'll see if maybe we want to be on for another hour or so on, or not another hour, but potentially being on for an hour on that Tuesday, so we can talk a little bit about the winter meetings and talk maybe potentially about some potential moves that could have potentially gone down.
All right, yeah, sounds good to me, Cameron. Thanks so much for having me on.
You bet, man. That was Fantasy Gurus, CJ Krainock, talking about baseball, talking about the winter meetings that will begin on Sunday night, or really just Sunday for that matter. But as always, talking about the fantasy landscape, talking about Josh Gordon, talking about the Falcons and the New Orleans Saints potentially on that Thursday night. Also talking about the games on Sunday, throwing out potentially even the draft picks, where could potentially the draft picks go and what is the fantasy impact necessarily of each and every quarterback. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Cam Parker Show. On Friday, we are going to try and get Mario Vitanzi on. We tried to get him on last Friday, but there was a prior commitment. Actually, it was on last Thursday. We tried to get him on, but he had a commitment to get to. We will do our best to try and get him on Friday. So thank you guys very much for tuning into the Cam Parker Show. As always, this has been, like I said, another edition. Tune in on Friday as we will have more Broncos discussion, talk about how putrid it's been, and we'll see if there is a sun peeking on the horizon of potential moves. We'll talk about it. This has been the Cam Parker Show.